Hi, this is Craig Stocks here for Utah Desert Remote Observatories. You can find us online at utahdesertremote.com. And today I want to talk about color mapping the SHO color palette in Photoshop. So let's jump in. We're going to use this data of the Lagoon Nebula as our example. And you'll see it's got some flare caused by the moon, but that doesn't really interfere with what we're trying to accomplish here. And I always start in PixInsight and then do the color mapping and blending in Photoshop because I think that really gives you the best control. So let's hop over into PixInsight just quickly to see what we do here. And I've already run this through WBPP, so I have my output files in a swap folder for the Lagoon, and this is the master files. And here you can see sulfur, oxygen, and hydrogen. So I'll just open those, and we'll quickly take a look at these. If I click on the screen stretch icon here, this will just give us a preview of what the data looks like. There's the sulfur. You can see the sulfur was heavily affected by the moon. The oxygen was somewhat less affected, but still has some lens flare. And the hydrogen probably came out the cleanest. It seems to have the least effect of the moon, although there may be some overall veiling glare here. Basically what I'll do with each one of these files, first I'll look at them to see if I need to run a dynamic background extraction, which would be to deal with any gradients. Surprisingly, there doesn't seem to be a strong gradient on these, so I'm going to skip that step because it does sometimes leave halos between the dark and bright areas. So I'll go straight to, typically the first thing I would do is run Blur Exterminator to sharpen up the nebula and sharpen up the stars. Then I'll stretch the image with the screen transfer function and the histogram and just reset it by clicking on the radioactive icon to get a fresh stretch. And usually I will use the scroll wheel to zoom into the scroll bar, and this is a monochrome image, so it doesn't really matter, but if it were a color image I would make sure to have the RGB channels linked. And typically I find I need to darken the darks a little bit, and the brights, sometimes I'll brighten them, sometimes I'll darken them. What I'm trying to do is get a good range of almost black and almost white, but nothing really blown out. So that looks like a pretty good compromise, so I would just quickly drag the triangle down to the histogram transformation, click on the square to apply that, and then we need to turn off the screen stretch. And at this point I would run Noise Exterminator and then Star Exterminator. And we have three different options for stars. This is the hydrogen, this is the oxygen, and this is the sulfur. And I feel like the oxygen has the best stars. So as I run through the oxygen, I'll also, when I extract the stars with Star Exterminator, also save those stars as an extracted file. So when I get all done, I have 4 grayscale images to save as 16-bit TIFFs, the stars, and then each of the 3 elements, the sulfur, hydrogen, and oxygen. And then we'll jump into Photoshop. And when we get into Photoshop, the first thing we always do is go to File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack. And by stack, what it means is layers. And it gives you this dialog box. Click on Browse to go find the files that we want to load as layers. And we'll have to navigate to wherever we saved those output files. And for me, that's going to be on my D drive in an Astro folder for Nook 1 and the Lagoon Nebula right there, M8 Lagoon. And there are the 4 TIFF files that we just saved. So click OK, and it loads those as the list, and then click OK again. And that will load each one of these 4 files as a layer over here on the right hand side in the layers palette. And just a quick comment on how I have Photoshop arranged. I have the layers palette on the right on the bottom. In the middle I have the adjustments, And this is where you can very quickly pull up a curves or levels or different kind of adjustment layer. And then at the top we have the properties panel, and for instance, if you have a curves adjustment layer, this is where it would show you the settings of the curve, and you can change those. And always keep all of the layers intact. And now they're all loaded. We have the stars on top. You never know what order it's going to load, but in this case it loaded the stars on top, which is what we want. And then underneath that the hydrogen, and then the oxygen, and then the sulfur on the bottom. And very quickly what I'll do is look at these. We can see some artifacts from star removal. I would just grab the spot healing brush and quickly go through and clean those up where we need to. I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing that because that's not what this tutorial is about. I have others online that have more information about dealing with the individual layers. But one of the most important things I do is I drop each one of these layers into a group or a layer group with Control G, and that will put the selected layer into a group, and then change the group name, in this case to sulfur. And if I click on the levels adjustment layer icon here in the adjustments panel, that will drop a levels adjustment layer right above that pixel bearing layer of the sulfur. So now we're done with sulfur temporarily. We'll come up to the oxygen, do the same thing, clean up any glaring errors, Control G to drop that into its own group, rename the group oxygen, and click on the levels to add a levels adjustment layer. Do the same thing quickly with hydrogen, change the name. This one I think I've got some pretty bright star artifacts here that I think I'll clean up just so that they're not distracting as we go through some of these other steps. That's good enough for now. Add a levels adjustment layer, and that brings us to the stars. Again, click on the stars, Control G, change the name to stars. I will add a levels adjustment layer in case I need to make the stars brighter or dimmer. And this layer, now we'll start with some of our actual processing. The stars layer, we know we're going to want in screen blending mode, and we just go to the adjust the levels or the blending modes dialog box, drop that down and choose screen, and you can see what it does. Because these stars are on a black background, any place where it's lighter than pure black, it adds to the layer below. And we can just turn these off for now so they're not in the way. The next thing we want to do is start exploring color mapping, and that's really why you're watching this video in the first place. First thing we need to do is check our document mode, and we do that by going to Image, Mode, and we can see that this is a grayscale image, and that's because all of the layers that we loaded were grayscale images. None of them were RGB color. And we need to change this document to RGB color. You can't color map in a grayscale image because it's only grayscale. We do get a warning asking if we want to merge these layers, and we do not want to merge them. So I'll click Don't Merge. And what it's doing now, it's created the three channels, red, green, and blue, so that each one of these layers now has equal amounts of red, green, and blue. And it's those red, green, and blue components that we're going to use to create color. So to start with, let's just turn off the hydrogen, and let's go to our oxygen group. So I'm on the group level for oxygen. And we want to start, at least I typically start by creating an SHO image and then add hydrogen to that and use hydrogen as the tool to balance the color. So to make this an SHO image, we know that each one of these layers has all three, red, green, and blue. And we want red from the sulfur layer and green and blue from the oxygen layer. And to change that, we'll just double click to the right of the group layer name where it says oxygen, and that'll bring up this layer style dialog box, and by default it'll be on the blending options tab. And we can see here in the center, since this is an RGB file, we have all three channels listed, red, green, and blue, with a checkbox for each one. we want oxygen to only represent green and blue. So if we just turn off the red, boom, we have an SHO image where sulfur is contributing the red. And it's actually contributing green and blue also, but since the oxygen layer is on top, the green and blue from the oxygen layer is overriding the green and blue in the sulfur layer, so we get an SHO image. And it's just that easy. Now let's play with the hydrogen. And we're going to do the hydrogen a little bit differently. If we wanted this to be just a pure HSO image, we could do the same thing with hydrogen. We can double click out here and change the colors that it's contributing to be just green. And that would give us a pretty standard starting point for an SHO image. But it does have a fair amount of green in it. And depending on how we stretch the individual elements, it may have more or less green. And we want to have more control than that. So we're not going to do that. Instead, we'll just cancel out of that. And we'll put the hydrogen layer, actually the group, into screen blending mode. And that will tend to make the whole image a little bit on the bright side, so we'll come down to our levels and we'll just darken it down a little bit so it doesn't look crazy bright. But now let's play with the color. And to play with the color, we're going to add a curves adjustment layer right on top of the levels. And I tend to adjust brightness or contribution of the layer with the levels adjustment layer. I tend to use curves to adjust the color that it's contributing. And right now it's contributing all three colors, red, green, and blue. But we know we want this to be an SHO image, and we want less red and probably a lot less blue in the hydrogen. But we may still want some. If you look at hydrogen naturally, and I think I'm going to sneeze here. There's some exciting video. If you looked at hydrogen, if you're looking at it through a hydrogen alpha filter, all you're seeing is the alpha line, which is the brightest emission line, which is a very deep red. Not quite as red as sulfur, which is why we map it more towards the green. But there's also a hydrogen beta emission line, which is a bluish or a cyan color, similar to the oxygen color. So the true color of hydrogen is going to be less red than sulfur, but also have some green and blue in it from the hydrogen beta lines. So we can play with that by reducing the green and blue to whatever amount we think looks good. And to do that, we're going to use the curves. And if you look at the curves properties, you can see that there's a drop down here for RGB. If I click on that, we'll see we can target individually the red, green, and blue channel. So this is the curve for this layer group, or for this layer, for the red, green, or blue. So let's start with the blue. I'll target blue, and I'll just grab the top right hand side of the curve and drag it down. And you can see what's happening is I'm taking blue out of the hydrogen, and we may want to leave some in. I usually do. Next, let's go to the green, and we can take some of the green out and let more of the red shine, or we can leave more of the green in. We probably don't want it full strength. And what I'm looking for is just a nice balance where we have good color contrast between the different elements. And then we may take some of the red out of this and let the red from the sulfur be a little bit more dominant. And at this point we may find that it's a little bit iterative. We may want to come back to the sulfur, for instance, and put a little bit more red in from the sulfur, and maybe darken the blacks of the sulfur, and maybe do the same thing with the hydrogen or the oxygen. Put a little bit more oxygen in, and then darken the blacks of the oxygen. And this is just an iterative visual process. The main control is this curve adjustment layer on the hydrogen group, where we can target individual colors and just decide visually how dominant do we want that color to be in the finished image. And color mapping then is that easy, and it's very visual, and I find it very fast and rewarding and easy to get an appealing color balance. If we want to make some overall adjustments, that's as easy as coming to the top of the layer stack above the hydrogen and below the stars. We could, for instance, add a simple curves adjustment if we want to increase the contrast. If we want to do a targeted adjustment, let's say we want to darken this area, we could add, for instance, a levels adjustment layer, darken, really focusing just on this part of the image to make it look a little bit darker and a little bit more dramatic. And then we'll come to the layer mask, and by clicking on the mask you'll see that there's a double outline around the mask, layer mask icon. Control-I on the keyboard will invert that from white, revealing everything, to black, hiding everything. Now I can grab my brush tool and paint with white at a reduced opacity, maybe 30 or 50%, and paint in some of that darkness. You want to keep it bright because it is a brighter part, but we don't want it to be too bright. And if we feel like we've gone too far, we can always come back and adjust the brightness of that adjustment layer. And then lastly, you may want to add a color balance layer and fine-tune some of the color balance. You may want to add a hue saturation and increase or decrease the saturation. You can even target individual colors here, for instance targeting the red and reducing the red saturation and brightness perhaps. And we might even adjust the hue of just the reds to make it a little bit more yellowish, a little warmer looking. And then decide, do I want stars? Yes or no? And it's really that simple. I really like this approach in Photoshop, first of all because I'm familiar with Photoshop, but I find it to be very fast and a very visual process, so that you're working visually based on how it looks rather than numerically and hoping that the numbers work out right. So I hope you'll give this a try. If you use Photoshop or want to use Photoshop in your Astro workflow, this is a great way to do it. If you're already working in PixInsight and you're perfectly happy with that, that's fine too. Whatever tool works well for you. If you have any questions, be sure to drop them in the comments and I'll try to answer them as best I can. And for now, I hope you have a great day today and an even better night tonight under a clear, dark sky. Thanks.